The trigeminal nerve is the principal general sensory nerve of the head, and it also innervates muscle that will move the mandible, like the muscles of the mastication. So this means that the trigeminal nerve has to carry sensory, but also motor fibers. But even though the three divisions are sensory, the ophthalmic and the maxillary divisions are purely sensory, hence the mandibular division has to carry the motor information. So the mandibular division, remember, is the only one that carries a motor component. And here we have a summary of the trigeminal nerve functions. So it carries general somatic afferent fibers and also branchial efferent fibers. The GSA, or general somatic afferent fibers, will provide sensory innervation of the face. The anterior half of the scalp, the mucous membranes of the oral and the nasal cavities, and also the paranasal sinuses, the nasopharynx, part of the ear and external acoustic meatus, part of the tympanic membrane, the orbital contents, and the conjunctiva, and the dura mater in the anterior and middle cranial fossa. Whereas the branchial efferent fibers, or BE, which are carried by branches of the mandibular nerve only, will innervate the muscles of the mastication, the tensor tympani, tensor belli palatini, the mylohyoid, and the anterior belly of the digastric. Now we will introduce the cranial nerve nuclei, and there are different types of nuclei. These are afferent nuclei, efferent nuclei, nuclei of the somatic efferent cell column, nuclei of the branchiomotor cell column, and nuclei of the parasympathetic cell column. But today I will just focus on those related to the trigeminal nerve. So when we talk about gray matter, this means that it's a collection of cell bodies. Now, we can find this collection of cell bodies in different parts of the body. So, in the central nervous system, but in the brain and brainstem, this collection of cell bodies is referred to nuclei. And again, in the central nervous system, but located in the spinal cord, this gray matter will be located centrally, and it will look like a butterfly. And we will name the different parts of this butterfly. So here we will have the anterior horn, the posterior horn, lateral horn, etc. of the spinal cord. And when this collection of cell bodies is located in the peripheral nervous system, we talk about ganglions. So don't forget this, as the location of the collection of cell bodies is what defines the name. Now, in this image on the right side, we have a coronal section of the brainstem from a dorsal view. As this is the brainstem, these are regions of gray matter, and therefore these are nuclei. In the left side, we have the position of afferent cranial nerve nuclei, so sensory, and in the right side, this is the location of the efferent cranial nerve nuclei, or motor. Also the same colors here, for example, this pinkish, this with this and this one, means that these nuclei come from the same embryological origin. Also remember that this is a representation of the location of these nuclei, so they made it easier to understand them by separating the sensory from the motor ones, but they are located in the right and in the left side of the brainstem, both of them. In the afferent nuclei, we find the cell bodies from the afferent fibers that carry general sensory information. For example, touch, pressure, pain, temperature as well, from the head, and that enter the brain through the trigeminal nerve at the level of the pons. And here, in the trigeminal sensory nucleus, this is a large nucleus that runs the whole length of the brainstem and extends caudally into the cervical spinal cord. The efferent nuclei, as we mentioned before, can be divided into three groups in relation to their embryological derivation. So the nuclei of the branchiomotor cell column, in this case, the one shaded in yellow is the column that innervates striated muscles derived from the pharyngeal. So here in the midpons is the location of the trigeminal motor nucleus, and this nucleus provides the fibers, the motor fibers, to the trigeminal nerve and innervates the muscles of the mastication, the tensor tympani, tensor vela palatini, mylohyoid, and anterior berry of the digastric, which are the ones that we saw in the table at the beginning of the lecture. The largest nuclei is the trigeminal sensory nucleus, which is located through all the length of the brainstem, and it will also extend in the upper cervical spinal cord. It is subdivided into three subnuclei. The superior one is the mesencephalic nucleus that extends rostrally into the midbrain. The chief sensory nucleus, also known as principal sensory nucleus, in the middle, located in the pontent region near to the fibers of the trigeminal nerve, and the most inferior one, this is the spinal nucleus, also known as nucleus of the spinal tract of the trigeminal, which extends caudally through the medulla oblongata into and into the spinal cord as well. Depending the modality they are carrying is where the afferent fibers will terminate. Fibers carrying touch and pressure will go to the chief nucleus. The ones that convey pain and temperature enter the spinal nucleus. And note that the proprioceptive afferents from the muscles of the mastication and the TMJ are the only primary afferent neurons that have the cell bodies located not in the peripheral nervous system, but in the central nervous system, and these cell bodies are located here in the mesencephalic nucleus rather than in the trigeminal. Then they will synapse here with the second order neuron that have the cell bodies in this nucleus, because remember that the nucleus is a collection of cell bodies. So here we have these cell bodies here. So they will the first order neuron will synapse with these second order neurons, and they will then decussate, making the Then they will synapse with the second order neuron that have the cell bodies in this nucleus, and the axons of the second order neurons will now decussate. So the axon of the second order neuron is the one that is, or are the ones that you can see in orange, and they will decussate, making the contralateral trigeminothalamic tract, which then will synapse with the third order neuron that is waiting for this information in the thalamus. So the cell bodies of the third order neurons are located at the ventral posterior nucleus of the thalamus, and the third order neuron will finally, or the axons of the third order neuron will finally go to the sensory cortex of the parietal lobe to make it conscious. The trigeminal nucleus also sends fibers to the cerebellum, hence this is unconscious, and there are a few reflex connections with certain motor neurons in the brainstem, and I will give 3 examples. The first one is the corneal reflex, where the afferent neuron, the sensory one, is carried by the trigeminal nerve, and this one will synapse here at the brainstem with an interneuron that will again synapse with the motor neuron, but now of the facial nerve related to the facial nucleus. So this reflex will then allow to close the eye. The sneeze and cough reflex are initiated by afferent neurons running in either the trigeminal nerve from the nasal mucosa or in the vagus nerve from the larynx and the trachea, and they will end up in the trigeminal sensory nucleus. And from here, there are indirect connections with diaphragmatic and intercostal and abdominal motor neurons that will innervate muscles for the forceful expulsion of air, and the nucleus ambiguus will be as well innervated pharyngeal and laryngeal muscles. And in the jaw jerk, there is a percussion here in the mandible, and this one will stimulate proprioceptors in the masseter and also in the temporalis muscle. So these afferent neurons that are traveling in the trigeminal nerve will establish a monosynaptic, which means only one synapsis, with motor neurons that are located in the trigeminal motor nucleus and will go to stimulate the same muscles, so the temporalis and masseter again. Remember the descending tracts where we have, for example, the corticospinal tract or pyramidal tract, which go from the cerebral cortex to the spinal cord, and from here to the skeletal muscles through the spinal nerves. Well, the corticobulbar tracts are similar to the corticospinal tract, but the only difference is that in the corticobulbar tract, the lower motor neurons are running in cranial nerves, whereas the corticospinal tract, the lower motor neurons are running in the spinal nerve. So observe in this diagram, as this is the descending or motor pathway, there are only 2 neurons involved. The upper motor neuron in mustard or yellow here from the motor cortex, and the lower motor neuron here in red. So the lower motor neuron exiting at this level belongs to the corticobulbar tract. Also remember that the motor component of the trigeminal nerve is only distributed by the mandibular nerve to the muscles of the mastication and the other muscles that we have mentioned before, the mylohyoid, anterior belly of the digastric, etc. The axons from the motor neurons of the trigeminal nerve come from cells in the trigeminal motor nucleus located at the level of the pons. So if this is a nucleus, then this is a collection of cell bodies in the central nervous system. And in this case, we talk about the cell bodies of the lower motor neurons located in the trigeminal motor nucleus. And they exit as axons running through the motor component of the trigeminal nerve. The axons then will exit at this level, at the level of the midpons, through the motor root, and then they will join the mandibular division of the trigeminal nerve, and the mandibular division innervate then the muscles that we have already mentioned before.